At the moment, while we are navigating to the add transaction view model from the transaction view model, after we select an item in the transaction view, we are passing the hard-coded ID of the transaction. Let's change that by using the real data. So let's use the selected transaction property and use the ID to pass that ID to the add transaction view model. What we can do is to use this ID in the add transaction view model and pre-populate the data on the view, and after we make some changes to the transaction, we can update that transaction. So let's go to the add transaction view model. We are getting the ID parameter and fill that to the ID property. So this property, what we are going to do is to in the initialize async method. So let's override initialize async method, and here we are going to pre-populate our fields in case we have the ID. I think I'm also missing the on appearing method here, and in this on appearing I'm going to take the binding context, cast that to the add transaction view model, and call the initialize async in order to pre-populate the fields. So let's go to the initialize async. First, we need to check if we have the ID. So if our ID is null or white space, or if we cannot parse that to int. So let's try to parse the ID to int out in transaction ID. So if we cannot parse that, I'm missing the get in the ID. That's why compiler is complaining. So I can just return the ID here. So if we don't have the ID, we can use these default values. Let's just quickly clean up the constructor a bit by extracting method. I'm going to name this method add validations and just put this method to the end of the file so that we have a better overview of what's happening in the constructor. So if we don't have ID, transaction date is datetime now, is deposit is true. But if we have our ID, that means that we can try to load the transaction using the repository, and we have the get by ID method, and we just pass the transaction ID. So here we just need to reverse this logic. If we cannot parse the ID, then we are using the default values. We have some errors, so let's just quickly fix them. Here I'm missing async, and here it says use of unassigned local variable. That's okay. If we don't have the transaction ID, then just return from the initialize async. Otherwise, get me the transaction and populate is deposit. So is deposit, we will get that from the transaction.status. If the status is equal to constants get transaction deposited, then we have is deposit set to true, amount dot value, we will get that from the transaction.amount, and transaction date is equal of the transaction date. Lastly, let's just set the selected coin. So we will use the coin get available assets to get all available assets, and then find the first one which has the symbol same as our loaded transaction. Let's just make sure the updating of an existing transaction works properly by passing the ID of the transaction we have selected in the transaction view. So if our ID that we passed is null or empty, then we will pass 0 as the ID, meaning that we will insert a new transaction. Otherwise, let's just go and parse that ID. Let's select the transaction and try to update the amount. If we update the amount, the transaction has been updated successfully.